So with that, we will hand over to Teru Konishi, who's talking about allegory, coherence, and narrative.
Perfect, thank you. I will try to share my screen. Here we go. And then presentation. And then, oh yeah, I have to do this. Okay, does that look better?
That's
That looks
great.
good. Yeah.
Perfect. So thank you. My name is Teru. I am a PhD student just in the stage of writing up actually right now at UCL. And my research interests have been about allegory and narrative, to be exact. And today I just want to talk about this idea that connects allegory and coherence and maybe why that is not so much, well, it's still a useful tool, but maybe it's not, useful in the way that we think. So the main question of the presentation is going to be twofold. It's going to be about what differentiates allegory and extended metaphor, and in turn, what makes allegory so special. And I would like to turn to this concept of narratives and story to answer that question. Maybe it might not, sound that coherent at the beginning, but hopefully by the end, this will all make sense. So as an overview, I'll just start by talking what I think allegory is, and then why we should and how we should think about coherence and allegory, because a lot of theorists have argued that what's unique about allegory is its coherence. And then I will ask a question whether metaphors are actually incoherent in that sense, so whether we can differentiate allegory and metaphor based on their coherence. And then I am going to introduce this notion of allegory as a story and why, allegory essentially being a story matters. And, it might sound like a very arbitrary point. It might sound like a very obvious point that allegory is a story, but maybe it's not that clear. So I will hopefully clarify my point along the way. So allegory, I define allegory as this, trope or genre. It can be both a trope or a genre that is characterized by two representations connected by analogical similarity. So the easiest way to think about, the example that everyone knows is animal farm. You have the story of farm animals revolting against its owner, whereas it also tells the story about the inner fighting of the Soviet Union. As I said, it's a label for a trope as well as genre, so it can happen in text as well as a standalone novel. And it's quite commonly argued as a type of an extremely extended metaphor. So this tradition starts from the times of Quintilian, but there are a lot of modern theorists that kind of follow this suit. But relevance theorists in particular think that there are reasons to think that allegory and metaphor are different. And the key word they use to explain this difference is that of coherence. So let me kind of introduce this quote by Carson Waring. They say, a key characteristic of allegorical tales is that they are entirely coherent at the literal level. They have an internal relevance which makes them fully interpretable at that level, even though the intended import requires another level of processing. In this respect, allegories differ from metaphors, including the extended ones. So that was the context of the paper, but essentially what they're saying is metaphors, extended metaphors in particular, are not really coherent on its own, whereas allegories are coherent. And they're not the first ones making this comment. And for example, Unger, who talks about allegory, makes this comment a lot in his paper. So the first thing to think about is what then is this coherence? And as Scott said, it's not really a good kind of measure to allude to dictionary definitions, but I will do so anyways. So the Cambridge English Dictionary says this, coherence is the situation when the parts of something fit together in a natural or reasonable way, or is a clear relationship between parts, especially in a work of literature or art. So there is this sense that is quite difficult to make into words, but it's this in-placeness or well-structuredness of a certain, string of words. There is a connection making logical sense that binds, linguistic elements together, and it makes sense to us in a way. And in this talk, I want to discuss mainly two different views of coherence. One I call structural coherence, and one I call psychological coherence. And I also would regard coherence, within discourse and coherence on its own. So metaphors, when they are put within a discourse, there is coherence of that metaphor within the discourse, within the larger discourse, and also the coherence within the extended metaphor itself. So the question is whether any of these could explain the distinction between allegory and extended metaphor as Carson Waring claimed. So structural coherence is basically this idea that's based on lexical, syntactic, and logical relationship between linguistic components called coherence relations. So this is more of a discourse pragmatic idea. That ideas are inherited from people like Hobbes, Halliday and Son, Mann and Thompson, like that. So, and all these structural coherence relations are usually signified often explicitly by markers. So it's quite easy to see for a set of sentences like Yasu ate a banana during class. It was because he missed lunch and was hungry. The because marks the coherence relation to the previous sentence. It's giving a reason. For in the latter, Yasu ate a banana during class, I'd like to go to the bear. There isn't really explicit marker. There isn't even an implicit marker that logically connects these two sentences in a coherent way. Now, it is an interesting tool, but it's not really exactly the correct tool if we are not dealing with multi-clausal utterances to start with. So metaphors, simple metaphors that are one sentence, just one clause, like Juliet is a son, is not really an ideal target for this structural coherence framework. But even when this idea of structural coherence is applied to multi-clausal extended metaphors, the concern is that the structural coherence does not really seem to provide this useful difference between allegory and metaphor. So let me give some examples. So this is an example given by Asher and Mascaridis, which is an expansion of sorrow. And I have also expanded upon it. So it's like this, huge expansion upon expansion of examples. But in this example, structural coherence still holds within the metaphor and within the discourse as well. So this is Disraeli talking about his political career. I have always despised politics, but I have climbed to the top of that greasy pole. Because of that, I know where I can slip, but also I know where I can have a firm grip. So again, within the discourse, this is all about, the relations are connected by buts and becauses. So there is a contrast relation and there's a consequence relation. And even within the extended metaphor itself, but I have climbed to the top of the greasy pole. Because of that, there are structural coherence markers. So in a sense, the metaphor is made coherent in that way. And obviously, the same goes for allegory, which we assume that it would be coherent. So this is a prime example I would be using. This is an example given by Unger. And I do expect some people to have objections to this example, and I might explain why people might find this example as an allegory objectionable in later parts. But Peter is a member of a parliament, and parliament is debating proposals for sanctions against some country's economic policies that have been threatening domestic industries. Well, quite relevant, I think, right now. And he believes that Michael's proposal goes too far, and even potentially having negative effects to the domestic economy. He comments on Michael's proposal, saying, Michael's proposal is absurd. It blows my mind to find out there are people who are so bent on destroying their enemies that they scuttle the ship on which they themselves are sailing, but the captain is willing to do so. So here again, within the broader discourse, Michael's proposal is absurd, and its connection to the latter clauses is also structurally coherent, as well as within the allegory itself. It blows my mind, but the captain is willing to do so. So again, structural coherence is not really the right tool, both within metaphor and allegory and within discourse. Structural coherence is ultimately kept. And this is not the type of coherence Carson Waring had in mind, which also, to just note, they also focus on coherence within the metaphor and allegory. So they don't really focus on within discourse. Do we have alternatives? Well, there is this idea of psychological coherence, which is more, tailored towards relevant theoretic explanations. So psychological coherence focuses on the interaction between context, discourse, and its audience. And it bases its idea on this intuition that cognitive workings of the human mind, try their best to make a text feel in place and, understandable to its reader. So examples of proponents of this view is someone like Giora, who talks about discourse well-formedness and degraded informativeness condition. But also, there are some relevance theoretic thinkers who use relevance theoretic framework to understand coherence, such as Blakemore, and also Wilson used this in her response to Giora. So what Blakemore essentially says is what I'm going to talk about here. But Blakemore says coherence arises from the continuity of a context. So that what that means is coherence arises from the previous utterance being highly accessible and relevant, and being a relevant context for the interpretation of the utterance following the previous utterance. So she gives this example. So A asks, what did Jane say? And B answers, it's 3 o'clock. And she says, there are two potential interpretations of this discourse. One is that Jane, A is reporting that Jane actually, so B is reporting that Jane actually said it's 3 o'clock. Or in the case where A and B needs to get on a train at 3 o'clock, B is just simply ignoring the question and reminding A, oh, it's 3 o'clock, we need to get on the train. And the latter, because it does not use the context introduced by what did Jane say, and it does not continue on that context, the latter is made incoherent, yet still relevant. So the second interpretation, yes. So what Blakemore says is that if a discourse is coherent, then it is because there's a continuity of context in the sense that assumptions made accessible by the interpretation of our own segment are used in establishing the relevance of the next. So they say that coherence is a consequence of the search for relevance, and because we basically assume that there is a continuity of context throughout a piece of discourse, we try to see coherence through it in a way. But again, this is also not the sense of coherence that Carsten Waring probably had in mind, and the argument goes similar to the argument we have against structural coherence. Both metaphor and allegory are psychologically coherent within themselves and within the broader discourse. So the metaphor example, again, it's the context of politics that continues throughout, as well as the context of the greasy pole that continues within the metaphor. So there is psychological, continuance or coherence there, as well as allegory. The allegory example, the context of the proposal, continues within the broader discourse, as well as the ship context continuing throughout the allegory. So psychological coherence, again, if metaphor and allegory are both coherent, we can't really base the distinction of allegory and metaphor based on this coherence. So what's next then? We can focus on, when they say literally coherent. So what Carsten Waring and Unger seem to be pointing cannot be structural psychological coherence, but some kind of semantic anomaly that is there. So metaphors have essentially a categorical mistake that we need to pick up on, whereas allegories usually don't. But on the other hand, we have metaphors that we regard as complete and not without semantic anomalies at all. So example is that of twice apt metaphors, such as a storm is brewing, that might be actually pointing to a situation where an actual storm is brewing and coming soon, but also something big is about, to happen. And also some extended metaphors are complete as well. The greasy pole example that I had before is arguably also complete without semantic anomalies. So metaphors can be completely coherent at the literal level, and it need not be, and it's not really typical for metaphors to do so, but it can. And the fact that it can points to the fact that, well, it might not be that we should be pointing at when we're distinguishing between metaphors and allegories. I mean, one way to is to bite the bullet and say, like, all coherent and complete metaphors are allegories. But I wish to go in a different direction and focus more on the concept of stories. So what I am going to say is that allegories differ from metaphors because they are stories. Allegories are distinct from metaphors because they tell some kind of story. And let me explain. So what is a story to begin with? Again, I'm not going through the dictionary definition anymore, but let's draw something from someone like a discourse analyst again. So in discourse analysis, narration as an act of storytelling is, thought of a lot, and they have multiple definitions, but the one I think is most relevant here is the one given by Laskarides and Asher, who says that given two discourse units, omega 1, 2, basically the narration holds if the event described in is a consequence of the other. So there is this sense that fictional and non-fictional events happening in succession, occurring in sequence within a temporal space, minimally creates this sense of narration and story. And they're not the only ones who express this idea. And Barthes basically says something similar, saying that stories basically could be boiled down to sequence of events where poems really can't. But temporal occurrence of events is not the only important element in the story, of course. And many, theorists point out to many, features that only stories presumably hold. So Labo, for example, separates narratives, simple narratives where just events are happening, from complete and fully formed narratives, and talks about the importance of including characters, settings, or the importance of narratives in them. Willingham, for example, reports that many storytellers and authors agree that the story's basic feature consists of causality, conflict, complications, and characters. And what I want to point to is this importance of characters in particular, because we seem to separate tropes that introduce agency of characters from those that really don't. And we talk about Unger's example of the shipwrecking. And so I said, like, some might find that objectionable, that it's an allegory. And I argue that that's because the shipwrecking example is minimal as a story. It does include some minimal characters, but they don't really have agency, as well as some events, but there is only two events, the sailing of the ship and the wrecking of the ship. So there aren't really a complex, temporal sequence of events that are happening. But again, it's still minimally a story. And compare this with something like the leaf first hung on, but a gust of wind blew it off the tree. Here, again, there is no sense of agency at all. This seems like an event merely being described and not really a story. So what I argue is that all stories essentially need to include two key elements. That's a temporal event structure and a sense of agency and a character. And the more optional features an utterance and discourse has, as well as more temporal event structures and more stronger agency and character, the stronger the feel that some part of discourse is a story. And this becomes relevant when we think about the differences between allegory and other tropes that make use of the same analogical cognitive feature, such as proverbs and mere analogical comparisons. So for example, a proverb such as "you can't put toothpaste back into the tube," that still has this, two references that I said is important, but still, it's not really a story. There is no characters involved. There are no temporal sequences of events. And that's how we separate something like proverbs and maybe something like allegories. Or maybe something like mere analogical comparisons, such as, saying to your friend who just got fired, Truman Capote was fired from his job before writing Summer Crossing. So how much time do we, okay. I'll try to be very quick. So the last part of this presentation, I'm going to try to talk about, okay, I've said that, okay, sequential events and characters are important of making something a story. Why are they so important? And that's because stories have a special role in our cognition. And this area is actually studied more in philosophy, and someone like Elizabeth Gamp has talked about how stories are really special have a really special role in our cognitive functioning. So she points out that stories have two functional roles. One is helping with memory of events, and one is being a guide to navigating our own life. So stories generally, telling stories is crucial in the structuring and organization of memories. we walk through time, a lot of events happen around us, and by basically segmenting and putting them into little compartments and connecting them together, that helps organize our memories in general. Also, stories act as a very useful navigation tool for our lives. So we are characters of our own life story, and we move through time and events. We move through time, and events occur through that time. So Camp basically says stories are wayfinding instructions for navigating our lives. They specify recurring types of events, situations, characters, and they offer diagnosis from recognizing them. So if that's the function of stories, then we know why allegories are so relevant to us in a sense. So allegories, being fundamentally stories, they make a complex dynamic of events easier to be comprehended. They make it easier to extract structures that can be analogically compared and experienced. And they basically give us hypothetical events and stories that we can schematize in our mind. And these comparisons offer predictive powers over future events and provide general lessons that are really relevant and meaningful to our lives. And because stories are essentially these ways that we manage our engagement with the world, and we make predictions and we make useful, contributions to our life, we basically start seeing, more similarities within a story to our lives compared to some random situation that doesn't really involve agency. Okay. So in conclusion, first of all, structural and psychological coherence and semantic anomaly do not really describe the distinction between allegory and metaphors sufficiently. Allegories are fundamentally stories and can be characterized by the existence of temporal sequence of events and agency in the characters appearing. And because allegories are a story, they're a powerful tool that can help us organize and navigate our lives. Thank you very much. And that's my list of references. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teru. So we'll open for questions. We've got just over 5 minutes for questions. Ryoko.
Hi, thank you. It was really interesting. Probably I misheard you. So one thing there's one thing I'd like to confirm, and the other is a question comment. The first thing I'd like to double check is, do you mean that metaphor and allegories are always distinct? They can't be distinct. Can metaphor be allegories at all?
So it's definitely a difficult kind of point, and it's a point that I've been struggling to kind of explain. A lot of so my understanding is that metaphor kind of gradually turns into what we call allegory by adding these story features. So they're not completely distinct. There is middle way between what we might see, a metaphor being more allegorical or not. But I want to base that on not on coherence, but on the story elements that it holds.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So something that might have started as metaphor has kind of established itself and had more relevance as a story rather than the local level. It sounds sounds a bit like what Deirdre Wilson discusses as external relevance in her 2016 work, and I think Kate Scott recently discussed visual storytelling or storytelling in that. So I don't know, just wondered if using that sort of ideas like external relevance might help you really distinguish metaphor and allegory if that's necessary.
So yes, I am very much aware of their work, and I, in particular Wilson's work, I think about, but I think one small quirk or problem I have with what Wilson says is about basically her construal, I think, makes allegory totally discontinuous from metaphor. So basically what she says is, allegories are fictional, which is not necessarily true as well. And because they are fictional, they basically try to communicate on another layer. So, and metaphors basically don't have this layer, and there isn't really a way, to connect like, something in between, so to speak. So metaphors are metaphors, allegories are allegories. Allegories have two layers because they're fictional, metaphors aren't. And basically what I'm trying to do is maybe that's not the way we go. We want to have some middle ground between what we call metaphor, what we call allegories in general.
Okay.
Does that make a little bit more?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's
Perfect.
really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions? No? So if there's no other questions, Teru, just to wish you the best for the writing up.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Yeah, and then just a reminder, or to anybody who's just joined this room, a reminder that our colleague Urjani Chakravarti has been unable to join us this afternoon because of a change in her travel plans. And so a recording of her talk, Relevance Theory, a comprehensive analysis of information to entertainment, will be available on the website for people to view, and I'm sure she'd be open for people contacting her with any questions or comments after that.